My name is Daniel Reeves. I am a federal fire lookout assigned to a remote tower in a protected forest zone. And this account is a complete and accurate record of everything that occurred during a single night on duty. I have chosen to write it plainly, without exaggeration, because the details matter. What happened did not unfold as a sequence of dramatic events. It revealed itself slowly, through small irregularities, the kind that are easy to dismiss, until they form a pattern you can no longer ignore. I arrived at the tower shortly after noon. The access road ended several miles below, and the final ascent was made on foot with my supplies distributed between 2 trips. The structure itself was a standard steel, framed lookout, elevated above the tree line on braced legs, with a small enclosed cabin at the top. It had been standing there for decades. According to the service records I reviewed before the assignment, it had been temporarily decommissioned 3 years earlier, following the disappearance of 2 rangers assigned to a routine patrol rotation. The tower was brought back online due to seasonal fire risk and understaffing. I was informed that my assignment would be solitary and limited to observation and reporting. I had worked isolated posts before. Solitude was not new to me. What drew my attention, even during the first hours, was the condition of the tower interior. It was clean in a way that suggested care rather than neglect. The cot was neatly made. The desk had been wiped down recently. The radio console showed minimal corrosion. This was inconsistent with a structure that had been unused for years. I assumed maintenance crews had been more thorough than expected. While organizing my equipment, I noticed a thin binder secured to the underside of the desk with a metal clip. It was not listed on the inventory. Inside were handwritten logs, not official incident reports, but personal notes written by previous lookouts and patrol supervisors. The entries were dated over a span of 15 years and referenced the same handful of names repeatedly. All of them belonged to rangers now listed as missing or reassigned without explanation. I did not read the binder immediately. I logged the tower status, calibrated the compass, and tested the radio. Communications were clear. Weather conditions were stable. Visibility extended well beyond the ridge lines. Everything suggested a routine watch. By dusk, the forest below settled into stillness. There were no visible fires, no lightning, no wind strong enough to sway the upper branches. The silence felt complete, but not unnatural. I prepared a simple meal and began my first night's sweep with binoculars, scanning for unauthorized lights or movement. That was when I noticed a dim glow to the northwest, deep within a section of forest closed to the public. At first, I assumed it was a reflection or a distant campsite. The light was steady, low to the ground, and partially obscured by trees. I marked the bearing and time and continued my sweep. 10 minutes later, the light had shifted. It was closer to the base of the tower, though still far enough to be ambiguous. There was no accompanying sound, no vehicle noise, no visible trail that would explain a direct approach. I attempted to raise the ranger station over the radio. The call went through, but the response was delayed and unusually brief. I was told there were no patrols scheduled in that sector and no authorized night operations. When I mentioned the light, the line went silent for several seconds before the dispatcher advised me to continue observation and report any changes. I returned to the binder after the call. This time I read carefully. Several entries described similar sightings. Isolated lights appearing after sunset, moving against the terrain in ways that did not align with foot traffic. One entry, written by a ranger named Mark Hensley, noted that the lights were often followed by radio anomalies and unexplained log entries appearing overnight. That detail unsettled me more than I expected. Official logs are not self-updating. I checked the tower's current logbook, which I had filled out earlier. My handwriting was present. The timestamp was correct. Nothing appeared out of place. When I looked up again, the light had vanished. The forest below was completely dark. No moonlight filtered through the canopy. I felt an unfamiliar sense of attention, as if the absence of light was deliberate rather than incidental. I told myself that fatigue was influencing my perception. I documented the observation and resumed my watch. At approximately 21:40, the radio activated on its own. There was no incoming call tone, just an open channel filled with faint static and intermittent breathing. I waited, assuming someone might speak. No voice followed. The breathing continued for nearly a minute before the channel closed abruptly. I attempted to log the incident. That was when I noticed a new entry, all written beneath my last notation. It was dated with the current day and time. The handwriting was not mine. It read, "If you can see the lights, the tower is already recording you." I did not add commentary. I did not respond over the radio. I sat still, listening to the structure around me. The steel beams creaked softly as they cooled in the night air. From somewhere below, I heard a single sharp knock, like metal striking metal, echoing up through the tower legs. I checked the perimeter with my flashlight. There was no one visible at the base. No movement among the trees. The light did not return. The radio remained silent. I understood then that this assignment was not about fire detection. It was about observation in the strictest sense. The tower was not simply a vantage point. It was a repository. It collected information in ways I did not yet understand. And it did not rely on the consent of the person stationed within it. I continued to write because the logs indicated that those who stopped documenting events did not leave the tower. Word count, approximately 120 words, include a cinematic image group at the beginning of each part that visually supports the atmosphere. Fire lookout tower at night. Horror forest lights, isolation, eerie silence. Use wide, realistic, grounded imagery. No fantasy creatures. I remained seated at the desk for several minutes after writing the last line. There was no immediate danger, no visible threat, and nothing in my training suggested what the correct response should be when a structure produced writing that did not originate from the person inside it. I decided that the only rational option was to continue observing and documenting events exactly as they occurred. Anything else would have required assumptions I was not prepared to make. At 22:05, I conducted another full visual sweep. The forest appeared unchanged, but my sense of scale felt distorted. The distances I had judged earlier seemed shorter, as if the darkness had compressed the terrain. I checked my compass and range markers to verify orientation. All instruments were functioning normally. The tower itself had not shifted, but my perception of its relationship to the land below had. I returned to the binder beneath the desk. Several entries were marked with symbols instead of dates. One page contained a list of names, written repeatedly in different handwriting styles, layered over one another until the ink had bled through the paper. I recognized three of them from official missing ranger bulletins. A fourth name was unfamiliar. It was written once at the bottom, followed by a single sentence. He stayed until the tower stopped writing. That phrasing implied a process, not an event. It suggested that the tower's behavior changed, depending on the presence of someone inside it. I looked up at the walls, the windows, the ceiling. The structure was inert. Steel glass bolts wiring. Nothing indicated that it could act independently. And yet, the evidence on the page suggested otherwise. At 22:18, the radio activated again. This time, the channel identifier displayed a ranger call, sign that was no longer in service. I knew this because I had reviewed outdated rosters earlier in the week. The call sign belonged to a ranger who had disappeared during a boundary patrol 7 years prior. The voice that followed was calm, professional, and precise. It identified itself, stated its location, and requested confirmation. The location it gave was directly beneath my tower. I did not respond immediately. I checked the visual perimeter again. Nothing moved at the base. The trees stood still. There were no lights, no shadows, no signs of a person waiting below. The voice repeated the request using my full name. That detail forced me to answer. I acknowledged the call and asked for clarification. The response came without hesitation. The voice stated that it had been attempting to report an incident for several hours, but had been unable to reach anyone else. When I asked what the incident was, the channel filled with static, followed by a brief sound that resembled wind passing through an enclosed space. The transmission ended abruptly. I logged the exchange in the official logbook, writing carefully and deliberately. When I finished, I noticed that another line had appeared beneath my entry, written in smaller script. Do not ask where they are. Ask what they recorded. I felt a tightening in my chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with understanding. The tower was not attracting people. It was collecting perspectives. It preserved observations in a form that did not degrade with time. Rangers who disappeared were not lost randomly. They were integrated into whatever system the tower represented. At 22:47, I observed the light again. It appeared closer than before, directly along the access route that led up the slope toward the tower. This time, it was joined by a second light, slightly offset, maintaining a fixed distance. They moved in unison, stopping when I trained my binoculars on them, and resuming only when I lowered the lenses. I did not report the sighting over the radio. I sensed that external communication was no longer reliable. Instead, I wrote a detailed description in the binder, noting the behavior of the lights and my own reactions. When I finished, I realized that the handwriting on the page matched my own exactly, even though I had not yet turned the pen. The knock came again, louder this time, resonating through the tower legs. It was followed by a scraping sound, slow and deliberate, as if something were testing the structure's stability from below. I leaned out the window and shone my flashlight downward. The beam illuminated the metal supports and the forest floor beyond. There was no one there. I closed the window and locked it, though I knew the gesture was symbolic. The tower was elevated well beyond reach. Whatever was interacting with it did not require physical access in the conventional sense. At 20:30-10, the radio came to life once more. This time, multiple voices spoke at once, overlapping but synchronized, each delivering fragments of routine patrol reports. Bearings, weather notes, trail conditions. All were spoken in the same neutral tone used during standard operations. The effect was disorienting, not because the content was alarming, but because of its familiarity. I recognized my own voice among them. The realization did not come with panic. It arrived with a sense of inevitability. The tower had begun incorporating my presence into its records. It was no longer simply observing me. It was learning how I documented the world. I stood and began pacing the narrow interior, counting steps, grounding myself in physical movement. The structure responded with a low vibration, barely perceptible, as if acknowledging the change in behavior. The lights below stopped moving. The forest fell completely silent. I returned to the desk and wrote a single line in the logbook. Observation ongoing. When I looked back at the page, the sentence had been extended. Observation ongoing. Subject compliant. I did not erase it. After the last entry appeared in the logbook, I made a conscious decision to stop reacting emotionally to what I was seeing. Panic would only distort my judgment, and denial would leave gaps in the record. If the tower was documenting me, then clarity and consistency were my only defenses. I sat down, adjusted the desk lamp to its lowest setting, and continued my watch as if nothing had changed. At 23:22, I noted a pressure change in my ears, similar to a sudden shift in altitude. The sensation passed quickly, but it was followed by a subtle hum that seemed to originate from the tower itself rather than the radio equipment. It was not loud enough to register as sound in the conventional sense. It was more like vibration, a steady resonance traveling through the metal frame and into the floor beneath my boots. I checked the weather instruments. Barometric pressure was stable. Wind speed was negligible. There was no environmental explanation for the sensation. I logged it anyway. The lights returned at 23:31. There were 3 this time, arranged in a loose arc along the tree line. They did not illuminate their surroundings. Each appeared as a contained point, dull and steady, like a lantern seen through heavy fog. Their spacing was deliberate, evenly distributed in a way that suggested coordination rather than chance. I raised the binoculars and held them steady. The lights did not freeze this time. Instead, they shifted orientation, subtly adjusting their positions to maintain alignment with the tower. I realized then that they were not moving toward me. They were orienting themselves around my vantage point. The radio remained silent. No static. No phantom transmissions. The absence of noise felt intentional, as if the system were allowing me to observe without interference. I took advantage of the moment to examine the binder again, focusing on the most recent entries. Several pages near the back had been added, long after the official decommissioning date. The handwriting varied, but the language followed a similar pattern. Each entry described a moment when the lookout realized that the tower was not simply a structure, but an active participant in observation. One entry stood out, written in a precise, almost mechanical script. Once the tower begins reflecting your voice, it is too late to leave unnoticed. I closed the binder slowly. My training emphasized evacuation protocols in the event of structural failure or immediate danger. None of those criteria were met. The tower was intact. I was physically safe. And yet, the idea of leaving felt increasingly abstract, like a concept that belonged to another version of the assignment. At 20:48, I heard footsteps on the stairs. The sound was unmistakable. Metal treads flexing under weight. A slow, deliberate ascent, one step at a time. I moved to the window and aimed my flashlight downward. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the upper portion of the stairway. It was empty. The footsteps continued. They were synchronized with the vibrations I had felt earlier, each step resonating through the tower's frame. I stood still, counting them. 12 steps, then a pause, then another 12. The rhythm was precise, almost measured. I did not call out. I did not unlock the door. When the footsteps stopped, the radio activated once more. A single voice spoke, calm and familiar. It identified itself as a ranger assigned to my sector. The name it used was mine. The voice reported clear conditions, no visible threats, and stable observation status. It concluded with a routine sign-off. The transmission ended cleanly, without static. I checked the logbook. A new entry had been added, timestamped to match the transmission. It was written in my handwriting, down to the smallest idiosyncrasies. I had not written it. The lights below dimmed slightly, as if responding to the completion of a task. One by one, they extinguished, leaving the forest in complete darkness once again. I felt a shift then, not in the environment, but in my understanding of my role. The tower did not lure rangers to their disappearance. It absorbed them gradually, using their own habits of observation and documentation to preserve their presence. The missing were not gone. They were recorded. At Ogerdio 7, I attempted to access the tower's external camera feed, a system installed for wildfire monitoring. The screen activated, but instead of displaying the surrounding forest, it showed the interior of the tower from multiple angles. Each feed was slightly offset in time, showing me sitting, standing, pacing, all within the same enclosed space. One feed lagged behind the others. In it, I had not yet turned to face the screen. I shut the system down immediately. The footsteps did not return. The lights did not reappear. The radio remained silent. The tower settled into a steady, almost comfortable stillness. I resumed considered documentation, noting each sensation, each anomaly without speculation. At Zoden 31, the binder beneath the desk slipped free of its clip and fell open to a blank page. A pen rolled across the desk and came to rest against my hand. I did not recall placing it there. I wrote. I documented my presence, my observations, my awareness of the process unfolding around me. I wrote until my hand cramped, until the words began to repeat themselves. When I finally stopped, the page was full. Beneath my final sentence, a line appeared in smaller text. Integration ongoing. Observation stable. I understood then that the tower did not need to restrain me. It only needed me to continue doing what I had been trained to do. And so I remained at my post, watching the forest that could no longer hide its records from the structure above it, listening to a silence that now included my own voice. The clock on the wall indicated Howgard 46, though the passage of time no longer felt linear. I noted the reading anyway, recording it alongside my observations because routine was the only structure I still trusted. My body was present, alert, and functional. Fatigue had not yet set in. Whatever process the tower was engaged in did not induce disorientation or physical distress. If anything, it seemed to preserve clarity. I conducted another sweep of the interior. Every object remained where it should be. The cot was untouched. My pack rested against the wall. The door was locked. The windows were sealed. The tower did not appear altered in any measurable way. The change was subtler, embedded in how information moved through the space. When I returned to the desk, I noticed that the official logbook had shifted slightly. It now overlapped the binder, as if the two had been intentionally aligned. I opened both. The most recent entries mirrored each other in content, but not in tone. Where my log, was factual and concise. The binder's version was reflective, almost interpretive, expanding on sensations I had not explicitly written down. One passage described the feeling of being watched by the land itself, not by a presence within it, but by the accumulation of recorded perspectives layered over time. I had not written that. I did not recall thinking it in those terms. And yet, reading it felt accurate. At E0103, the hum returned stronger than before. It pulsed at a steady interval, matching my heart rate. I stood to break the synchronization, walking the perimeter of the room. The hum adjusted, slowing, then stabilizing again. The tower was not reacting to movement. It was responding to presence. I attempted another radio check, initiating the call myself this time. The signal connected immediately. No dispatcher answered. Instead, I heard a sequence of familiar sounds, the click of a mic activating, a breath drawn in preparation to speak, and then silence. I waited. Nothing followed. I terminated the call and logged the attempt. A new entry appeared beneath it almost instantly. Outbound communication acknowledged. Redundant. I did not challenge the wording. I focused instead on the implications. The tower was not preventing communication. It was categorizing it. External contact was unnecessary to its function. As 0117 movement returned to the forest. Not the lights this time, but shadows shifting against the tree line. Subtle changes in density where the darkness seemed to thicken and thin. I watched through binoculars, careful not to track too aggressively. The shadows did not approach. They remained at a consistent distance, as if marking a boundary rather than testing it. I thought of the missing rangers, of patrol routes that ended abruptly, of reports filed and closed without resolution. The binder suggested they had not vanished all at once. They had faded from the outside perspective as their observations were internalized by the tower. The stairs creaked again. This time, there was no rhythm. The sound was irregular, uneven, like someone unfamiliar with the structure placing weight cautiously. I accelerated toward the window, flashlight already in hand. The beam illuminated the midsection of the stairs. A shape occupied the space briefly, then dissolved into shadow before I could focus on it. There was no sound of retreat. I closed the window and recorded the sighting. The binder updated simultaneously, adding a note in a different hand. Visual artifacts increased during transition. That word held weight. Transition implied direction. At ZO134, I noticed that the external camera system had powered back on. I had not touched the controls. The screens displayed the forest again, but the perspective was wrong. The angle suggested a viewpoint lower than the tower, closer to ground level, as if the cameras were no longer mounted where they should be. One feed showed the base of the tower from several yards away. In the frame, a figure stood motionless, facing upward. The resolution was poor, but the outline was unmistakably human. The posture was familiar. The proportions matched my own. I shut the system down again, this time disconnecting the power entirely. The hum subsided. The screens went dark. The forest outside remained still. I sat back down and wrote, documenting the camera anomaly without interpretation. My handwriting remained steady. The act of writing grounded me, reinforcing the boundary between observer and environment, even as that boundary thinned. At 01:52, the binder produced a new page on its own, sliding forward as if guided by a draft that did not exist. The page was blank, except for a single sentence centered at the top. Final alignment requires confirmation. I understood what it was asking without being told. The tower had been gathering my observations passively. Now it required active consent, not in words, but in behavior. To continue documenting was to agree. I considered stopping. I considered leaving. The stairs were accessible. Dawn was hours away, but not unreachable. I could descend, follow the trail by headlamp, reach the access road by morning. The thought felt distant. Unreal, like a scenario I had read about rather than an option available to me. I picked up the pen. I wrote a confirmation, phrased as a routine status update. Observation ongoing. Conditions stable. Presence maintained. The words felt neutral, procedural, devoid of emotion. The tower responded with silence. No hum, no footsteps, no lights. The forest resumed its natural sounds, faint and distant. For the first time since nightfall, the environment felt ordinary. I logged the time 02:06. The binder added one final line beneath my entry. Record accepted. I leaned back, in the chair, aware that nothing visible had changed, and that everything essential had. The tower no longer needed to test my awareness. It had incorporated it. I remained on duty, watching a forest that now watched back through layers of accumulated memory, knowing that when morning came, I would still be here, and that the record would continue, whether I added to it or not. After the binder acknowledged the record, the night entered a phase of quiet that felt earned rather than imposed. I remained seated, hands resting flat on the desk, eyes adjusting to the low light. The clock continued to advance, minute by minute, but the sense of urgency had dissipated. The tower no longer pressed against my awareness. It observed, patiently, as if satisfied with my compliance. At 02:14, I noticed the first sign of fatigue. Not confusion or disorientation, but a heaviness in my limbs. The kind that follows sustained focus rather than fear. I stood, stretched, and moved slowly around the interior to maintain circulation. The tower did not respond. No vibration. No hum. The stillness felt deliberate, like a system entering a stable state after calibration. I checked the forest again. The darkness had thinned slightly, not from moonlight, but from the subtle promise of approaching dawn. The treetops were still silhouettes, but their outlines were clearer now. There were no lights. No shadows that moved independently. Whatever boundary had been established earlier remained intact. I returned to the logs to ensure continuity. The official book showed my most recent entries, unchanged. The binder remained open to the confirmation page, the ink dry and unmoving. For the first time since nightfall, nothing appeared between the lines. The absence of unsolicited additions was reassuring, though I suspected it was temporary. At 02:27, the radio emitted a brief tone, softer than a standard alert. It did not open a channel. It did not transmit audio. It was simply a signal, a notification without content. I logged it as such. The binder mirrored the entry, but added a parenthetical note. Phase boundary acknowledged. I did not know what phase it referred to, but the timing suggested a transition from active integration to maintenance. The tower had learned my patterns. It no longer needed to test them. I attempted to sleep at 02:41. Not fully, but enough to rest my eyes. I lay on the cot with my boots still on, the desk lamp casting a faint glow across the ceiling. My mind remained alert, cataloging sounds and sensations. The tower did not intrude. The forest below produced normal nocturnal noise, distant insects, a faint rustle of leaves. Nothing out of place. I drifted briefly, not into sleep, but into a shallow state where thoughts slowed without losing coherence. In that state, I became aware of another presence. Not external, not audible, but perceptual. It felt like a memory that did not belong to me surfacing gently, without force. Images of patrol routes, of familiar landmarks seen from ground level rather than from the tower. The sensation was observational, not emotional, as if I were reviewing footage rather than recalling experience. I sat up immediately and wrote down what I had perceived. The act felt necessary, preventative. The binder accepted the entry without commentary. No new lines appeared. The tower remained silent. At 03:05, I noticed that the external camera system had reactivated once more. This time, I did not shut it down immediately. I approached the screens carefully and observed. The feeds displayed the forest from correct angles again, consistent with the tower's height. There was no interior feed, no delayed reflection of my movements. The system appeared restored to its intended function. One feed, however, showed a narrow trail I recognized from the binder entries. It was a patrol route discontinued years ago, following repeated incidents. The camera angle was static, as if the system had been manually directed to that location. I checked the controls. No input had been made. The trail was empty. I watched for several minutes. Nothing entered the frame. No movement disturbed the foliage. The feed remained fixed, persistent. I logged the anomaly and left the system active, choosing observation over interference. At 03:22, the first hint of color returned to the horizon. The blackness softened into deep blue, then gray. Dawn approached slowly, without ceremony. The tower's interior brightened, just enough to reduce reliance on artificial light. I turned the desk lamp off and allowed the natural light to take precedence. The binder did not react. I stepped outside onto the narrow catwalk that encircled the cabin. The air was cold but clean. The forest stretched endlessly in all directions, unchanged by the night's events. From this vantage point, it was easy to believe that nothing extraordinary had occurred. That belief did not hold, but it was tempting. As the light increased, I noticed markings on the metal railing. They were faint, shallow scratches, arranged in parallel lines. I had not seen them the previous day. They were not deep enough to compromise the structure, but they were numerous, extending along the length of the catwalk. They resembled tally marks. I counted them. There were more than I could reasonably account for, in a single assignment. I returned inside and documented the observation. The binder responded with a single line, written neatly beneath my entry. Accumulated presence. At 03:47, the radio came alive one final time. A dispatcher's voice spoke clearly, asking for a routine status update. The tone was normal. The call sign was correct. There was nothing anomalous about the transmission. I responded with standard protocol, reporting clear conditions and no incidents. The dispatcher acknowledged and signed off. The line closed cleanly. I waited. Nothing followed. No added lines. No corrective notes. The tower accepted the exchange as valid. Dawn continued to break. The forest regained depth and detail. The sense of enclosure lifted slightly, though it did not disappear entirely. I understood then that the tower's influence was not bound to night. Darkness had facilitated the process, but it was not required to sustain it. At 04:12, I wrote my final entry of the night, summarizing observations without speculation. I signed it. The binder did not append anything. I remained at my post as the sun rose fully above the ridgeline, illuminating a landscape that appeared unchanged, but felt permanently altered by what it now contained. The tower stood silent and still, a structure that recorded without judgment, preserving every perspective entrusted to it. I understood that my assignment had not ended with the arrival of daylight. It had simply entered a quieter phase. Morning settled over the forest without announcement. The sun cleared the ridgeline gradually, light spreading across the canopy in uneven bands. From the tower, the view was deceptively peaceful. If I had arrived fresh at that moment, unaware of the night behind me, nothing would have seemed unusual. That, I realized, was part of the design. The tower did not mark its changes visibly. It preserved continuity. At Zo 428, I conducted a standard daylight sweep. Visibility was excellent. No smoke columns, no unauthorized movement. No signs of recent disturbance along the visible trails. The access road remained empty. The forest had resumed its ordinary rhythms. Birds began to call sporadically, tentative at first, then more confidently as the light increased. I logged the sweep. The binder remained inert. The silence from the tower felt different now. It was no longer expectant or evaluative. It felt administrative, like a file closed but retained. I suspected that my role had shifted from subject to reference. The tower no longer needed to test my awareness. It had already categorized it. At Zo 4741, I noticed something subtle but persistent. My shadow, cast by the rising sun across the interior wall, did not align perfectly with my movements. The discrepancy was minimal, a fraction of a second at most, but consistent. When I raised my hand, the shadow followed just late enough to be noticeable. I tested it several times, varying speed and angle. The delay remained constant. I did not record this immediately. I wanted to be certain. When I finally wrote it down, the binder reacted for the first time since dawn. A single annotation appeared beside my entry. Residual offset within acceptable range. That phrasing implied a threshold. I did not know what would happen if the offset exceeded it. At 0502, I heard voices in the forest. They were distant and indistinct, carried upward by the slope and filtered through trees. At first, I assumed they belonged to a patrol team. The cadence matched professional movement, measured and purposeful. I listened carefully, straining to separate words from ambient sound. I could not make out individual phrases, but the rhythm was unmistakable. It was the sound of rangers communicating, quietly during a sweep. I raised the binoculars and scanned the lower ridges. There were no visible figures, no flashes of reflective gear, no movement that corresponded to the voices I was hearing. The sound persisted for several minutes, circling the tower's base without approaching. I logged the auditory anomaly. The binder did not comment. At 05:19, the radio crackled with a routine update from a neighboring sector. The ranger on duty reported clear conditions and requested confirmation of my status. The exchange was normal in every respect. I responded accordingly. There was no interruption, no delay, no anomalous echo of my own voice. The tower allowed the interaction. That distinction mattered. It suggested that external communication was not forbidden. It was simply unnecessary unless it aligned with the tower's internal record. The system did not block input. It filtered relevance. I prepared a simple breakfast at 05:33. The act felt grounding. The smell of heated food, the mundane clatter of utensils, the familiar routine of cleanup, all of it reinforced my physical presence. I paid close attention to my sensations, noting nothing out of the ordinary. My hands were steady. My appetite was intact. My thoughts remained organized. And yet, I could not shake the awareness that some part of me was now duplicated elsewhere, preserved in a format I could not access directly. At 05:47, The external camera system shifted focus again. This time, the movement was slow and deliberate, panning across the forest floor near the base of the tower. The feed stopped on a section of ground that appeared undisturbed at first glance. Then I noticed the tracks. They were footprints, partially obscured by leaf litter, arranged in a loose circle. The size and shape were consistent with standard issue boots. There were many sets overlapping and converging, as if multiple individuals had stood in that exact location for an extended period. None of the tracks led away. I magnified the image and counted distinct impressions. The number exceeded the known missing from this sector alone. I logged the observation. The binder added a line beneath it. Convergence point confirmed. At 06:04, a service vehicle appeared on the access road below, its progress visible through gaps in the trees. This was expected. A scheduled resupply and welfare check had been planned weeks in advance. I felt a brief, irrational sense of relief at the sight of another human presence, even at a distance. The vehicle stopped at the trailhead. A ranger exited and began the ascent on foot, moving steadily but without urgency. I recognized the gait. It belonged to someone experienced, comfortable with the terrain. As the figure climbed, the tower reacted for the first time since sunrise. The hum returned, low and brief, like a system waking momentarily to process new input. It faded as the ranger drew closer. At 06:21, there was a knock at the base of the stairs. I did not respond immediately. I watched through the window as the ranger began the climb. The steps creaked under his weight, the sound matching my expectations perfectly. Nothing about the scene appeared distorted or delayed. When he reached the door, I unlocked it and opened it without hesitation. The ranger introduced himself professionally, exchanging names and confirming my identity. His demeanor was calm, his tone appropriate. He asked routine questions about conditions, equipment status, and my well-being. I answered honestly, omitting nothing that could not be substantiated. He listened, nodded, and took notes. At one point, his gaze drifted to the binder on the desk. He did not touch it. He did not ask about it. He simply acknowledged its presence with a brief pause, then returned his attention to me. Before leaving, he asked a single question that had not been part of the checklist. Have you noticed any discrepancies in your observations yet? I asked him to clarify. He shook his head slightly, as if reconsidering. Never mind, he said. If you had, you'd already be writing them down. He descended the stairs and disappeared into the forest. The tower did not react to his departure. The hum did not return. The binder remained still. At 06:43, I documented the interaction in full. The binder added one final annotation, written in a careful, unfamiliar hand. External validation complete. Record integrity maintained. I understood then that the tower did not isolate its occupants from the outside world. It contextualized them within a larger archive. Visitors came and went. The record remained. As the morning advanced, and the forest settled fully into daylight, I resumed my duties with the same diligence I had before. The difference was not in what I observed, but in the knowledge that my observations were no longer ephemeral. They were retained, layered, and referenced long after the observer moved on. I remained at my post, aware that the tower now recognized me, not just as a lookout, but as part of its structure, another perspective anchored in steel and glass, watching a landscape that remembered everyone who had ever watched it from this height. Late morning brought a quality of light that flattened the landscape, reducing shadows and softening contrast. From the tower, depth perception improved, but detail felt muted, as if the forest had been rendered slightly out of focus. I logged routine conditions and continued observation, conscious of the subtle ways my attention, now aligned with the tower's own patterns. At Zo 7:18, I noticed the first inconsistency of the day. A column of smoke appeared briefly to the southeast, thin and pale, rising straight up before dispersing. It was visible for less than a minute. I trained the binoculars on the area immediately, noting the bearing and estimating distance. When I lowered the lenses, the smoke was gone. There was no residual haze, no scent. The forest canopy showed no sign of disturbance. I logged the sighting. The binder responded after a delay of several seconds, longer than any previous annotation. Ephemeral signal acknowledged. No action required. That phrasing suggested the tower distinguished between events that required intervention and those that existed solely to be recorded. The distinction was not based on threat level, but on permanence. At Yo 741, the radio received a general broadcast about staffing adjustments. Several posts would remain active longer than scheduled due to resource constraints. My assignment was extended by 12 hours. The information should have prompted a response from me: confirmation, acknowledgement, some reaction. I gave one, professionally and without comment. The tower remained silent. The extension did not surprise me. Leaving had felt theoretical since dawn. As the hours progressed, I became aware of a pattern in my own documentation. My entries were shorter, more efficient, focused strictly on observable data. Descriptive language had dropped away without conscious effort. Where earlier notes included sensation and context, the newer ones resembled compressed summaries. I did not feel diminished by the change. I felt optimized. At 08:09, the external cameras shifted again. This time, they did not move to the forest floor or a trail. They displayed a wide shot of the horizon, panning slowly across distant ridges. The movement was smooth and continuous, as if guided by a steady hand rather than an automated sweep. I watched the feed for several minutes, then realized something subtle. The camera was following smoke that was not visible to the naked eye. On the screen, faint distortions marked the air, barely perceptible currents rising and dissipating. The system tracked them with precision, mapping patterns that suggested past fires rather than active ones. Burn scars invisible from this distance. Thermal memories retained by the land. I logged the observation. The binder added a short line: legacy data integration. At Zo 8:34, I experienced another offset. This time, it was auditory. Sounds reached me slightly out of sequence. Bird calls overlapped in ways that defied distance. A call from the east arrived simultaneously with one from the west, though the terrain should have delayed one relative to the other. The effect was subtle but consistent. The tower was synchronizing inputs, aligning disparate sources into a single temporal frame. I wrote it down. No annotation followed. The absence of commentary felt deliberate. The tower no longer explained itself. At 09:02, I found a new page inserted into the official logbook, not the binder. The paper matched the stock exactly. The formatting was identical. The handwriting was mine, but the entry predated my arrival by several years. It documented a clear day, no incidents, routine patrols. The signature at the bottom was not mine. I compared the ink. It was old. I did not remove the page. I documented its presence and continued. At 09:27, movement appeared at the edge of my vision while I was scanning the northern sector. I turned quickly, expecting to see wildlife. Instead, I saw a man standing on a distant ridge, fully visible in daylight. He wore ranger gear consistent with an older uniform standard. He did not wave. He did not signal. He stood still, facing the tower. The distance was too great to identify facial features. I raised the binoculars. When I did, the ridge was empty. I lowered them. The man was there again. I held my gaze steady without magnification. The figure remained unchanged, as if the act of focusing disrupted the alignment. I resisted the urge to look closer. After several seconds, the figure turned and walked away. Disappearing behind the slope, I logged the sighting. The binder did not respond. Instead, the official logbook updated with a single added word beneath my entry: confirmed, at 09s and 51. The radio activated with a brief transmission from the ranger station. It requested verification of visual anomalies reported by aerial survey, discrepancies between observed terrain and recorded maps. I responded truthfully, stating that I had noted minor inconsistencies, but no actionable threats. The dispatcher paused before acknowledging. "Copy," they said. "We're updating records." The phrase lingered with me. Updating records implied that the map was changing to match observation, not the other way around. As late morning approached, the forest grew more active. Wind picked up slightly. Leaves shifted. Shadows moved with the sun. The ordinary world asserted itself convincingly, if not for the accumulated record around me. The binder, the altered logs, the camera behavior, I might have believed had been an anomaly. At 1018, the tower produced its most direct message yet. The binder opened on its own, pages flipping with controlled speed until they stopped at a blank sheet. A sentence appeared, letter by letter, as if written by an unseen hand that paused to consider each word. Continuation requires succession. I read the line several times. Succession implied replacement, not escape. The tower did not need me indefinitely. It needed continuity. I closed the binder gently and returned it to its place. I did not write a response. At 10:37, I observed a second service vehicle on the access road, farther out than the first had been earlier. It did not stop at the trailhead. It continued past, moving toward another sector. The forest absorbed it quickly. I realized then that the tower was not isolated. It was one node among many, each maintaining its own record, each requiring observers to sustain it. Missing rangers were not anomalies. They were transitions that had gone unrecognized. At 10:59, I wrote a summary of the morning's events, concise and factual. The binder remained silent. The official logbook accepted the entry without alteration. The sun climbed higher. The tower cast a shorter shadow. The world looked increasingly ordinary. And yet I knew that if I were to leave now, the record would not end. It would simply note my absence and wait for the next observer to arrive, ready to align them with the accumulated memory of the forest. I stayed at my post, watching a landscape that no longer existed solely in the present, aware that observation itself was the resource being managed, and that the tower would continue its work long after my shift and my presence had been fully accounted for. By late morning, the sun had climbed high enough to drain the forest of ambiguity. Shadows shortened, colors sharpened. The kind of clarity that usually resolves uncertainty settled over the landscape. It should have dispelled what lingered from the night, but instead it exposed how little of the process depended on darkness at all. At 11:14, I performed another full sweep, slower than required, more deliberate than routine, No smoke. No movement out of bounds. Trails visible from elevation were empty. The access road showed no traffic. Everything aligned with expectation. I logged the sweep. Neither book responded. The absence of commentary had become its own signal. The tower no longer needed to guide me. It had already indexed my behavior. At 11:29, the offset in my shadow worsened. The delay was no longer subtle. When I raised my hand, the shadow hesitated, then followed with a smooth, measured lag. It was consistent, repeatable. I tested it against the wall, against the floor, against the railing outside. The same delay persisted in every orientation. I recorded it. The binder remained silent. That silence felt final, like a system that had moved past diagnostic feedback and into steady operation. At 11:46, the radio issued a short priority alert. Not an emergency, not a call directed at me specifically, but a general notice about a missing ranger report being reopened in an adjacent sector. The name was unfamiliar. The details were sparse. Last known location, a lookout tower, scheduled for inspection but never reached. I noted the time and frequency of the broadcast. As I did, I became aware of a strange certainty. The report would not be resolved. Not in the way the station expected. The tower had already accounted for that absence. The delay was administrative, not investigative. At 12:03, the heat inside the cabin increased sharply. The windows amplified the sunlight, trapping warmth against the metal structure. I removed my jacket and opened a vent to circulate air. The movement caused a brief distortion in my peripheral vision, like heat shimmer. For a moment, the interior appeared doubled, overlapping versions of the same space misaligned by inches. Then it resolved. I stood still, heart rate steady, breath controlled. The effect did not return. I did not write it down immediately. I waited to see if the space would correct itself again. It did not. At 12:21, the external camera system powered on without prompt. The feed showed the tower from a distance I recognized as impossible. The angle suggested a position well beyond the nearest ridge, elevated and offset, as if the camera were suspended in open air. The tower stood alone in the frame, isolated against the forest. The image was stable, high resolution, and bright with midday light. Nothing moved. No birds crossed the frame. No clouds passed overhead. The camera began to zoom. As it did, I noticed figures around the base of the tower. They were not distinct enough to identify individually, but their number was unmistakable. Dozens of human silhouettes stood in a loose ring, evenly spaced, facing inward. None moved. None looked away. The zoom continued until the figures filled the frame. Then the feed cut. I disconnected the system completely, removing power and severing the cable at the junction box. The screens went dark. The hum did not return. The tower did not react. At 12:39, the binder opened. This time, the page was not blank. It contained a list, names only, many of them. Some I recognized from the binder's earlier entries. Others were new. Near the bottom of the page, my own name appeared, written in the same careful script as the others. There was no annotation, no explanation. I closed the binder. The act felt less like defiance and more like acknowledgement. At 20:57, a helicopter passed overhead, its distant thrum cutting cleanly through the still air. I stepped outside and watched it cross the sky, moving toward the northern sectors. It did not alter course. It did not slow. The tower did not register its presence in any observable way. I understood then that observation was selective. The tower did not record everything. It recorded what remained. At 13:16, I received a direct call from the ranger station. A supervisor I had spoken with before asked if I could stay on beyond the extended shift, citing staffing issues and weather projections. The request was phrased casually, professionally, as if the answer were optional. I agreed. The decision required no deliberation. Leaving felt incomplete, like interrupting a sentence before its end. I logged the extension. The binder added nothing. At 13:34, I noticed something missing from the interior. My pack, which had been resting against the wall since arrival, was gone. There was no sign of forced movement, no disturbance. It had simply been removed. I searched the cabin thoroughly. Nothing. I did not panic. The absence felt procedural, like equipment reallocated after reassignment. I documented it. The binder remained still. At 13:52, the shadows outside began to lengthen again. Not because the sun had shifted significantly, but because the light itself had changed quality. The afternoon deepened. The forest grew denser in appearance, edges less defined. The clarity of midday receded. I realized then that the cycle was repeating, not resetting. Each phase layered over the previous one, accumulating rather than replacing. At 14:11, the radio issued a final update for the hour. Routine traffic, no anomalies, no requests. The tone was neutral, familiar. I responded automatically. When the call ended, I noticed that my voice had not come from my throat alone. It resonated through the cabin, echoing faintly from the walls, as if the structure itself had spoken in unison. I wrote that down. For the first time since morning, the binder responded. Succession pending. I closed both books and stood at the center of the tower, feeling the vibration of the structure beneath my feet, the weight of accumulated records embedded in steel and glass. The forest waited below, unchanged and yet irrevocably marked by the act of being watched. I understood that the tower was preparing for transition. Not immediately. Not dramatically. Gradually, the way it did everything. And as the afternoon edged closer to evening, I remained at my post, fully aware that the final phase would not announce itself with urgency, only with the quiet certainty of a record reaching completion. By late afternoon, the light began to thin again. The sun angled lower, casting long bands of gold across the forest canopy. The change was gradual, almost gentle, and yet it carried the same weight as the onset of night had hours earlier. I marked the time, 16:38, and continued observation without interruption. The day had not ended. It had folded back into itself. The tower felt settled. Not dormant, not acted in the way it had been during the night, but complete. Like a document that no longer required edits. The hum did not return. The radios remained stable. The cameras stayed dark. What remained was presence. At 16:52, I noticed that my reflection in the window did not match my posture precisely. The difference was slight. My shoulders appeared squared when mine were relaxed, my head held at a more deliberate angle. The reflection did not lag. It anticipated. When I shifted, it adjusted at the same time, but not quite in the same way. I did not test it further. I wrote instead, documenting the discrepancy in neutral terms. The binder did not open. The tower did not annotate. The record accepted the entry as sufficient. At 17,011, the forest below showed signs of evening movement. Animals emerged cautiously. Wind threaded through the upper branches. The world resumed its ordinary cycle, convincing enough that I understood how easily the tower could be overlooked. How many assignments had passed without incident? How many observers had stood here, written their logs, and left without realizing what had been added to the archive in their absence? At 17:26, the radio broadcast a routine end of day summary. Weather stable. Fire risk moderate. Staffing notes unchanged. The voice was calm, familiar. I acknowledged receipt. This time, the echo was unmistakable. My words returned to me a fraction of a second later, layered beneath my own voice, identical in tone and cadence. The sound did not come from the radio speaker. It came from the structure itself, reverberating softly through the beams. I remained still until the line closed. I did not write that down immediately. I waited to see if the tower would. It did not. At 17:43, I stepped outside onto the catwalk for the last time that day. The air had cooled. The forest stretched out endlessly, illuminated by slanting light that emphasized contours and ridgelines. From this height, it was possible to see how the land itself recorded history. Burned scars fading into regrowth, trails etched faintly into slopes, clearings reclaimed by time. I noticed then that the tally marks on the railing extended farther than before. Not newly scratched, but newly visible, as if the angle of the light had revealed them. They wrapped around the tower in a continuous sequence, unbroken. I did not count them again. At 18:02, I returned inside and found the desk cleared. The binder was gone. The official logbook remained, open to the last page I had written. My pen rested beside it, aligned carefully with the edge of the desk. I felt no urgency to search for the binder. Its absence felt appropriate. The transition it had been preparing me for no longer required instruction. I wrote a final entry. I documented the end of the observation cycle, the return of evening conditions, the absence of anomalies requiring action. I summarized the day in clear, concise language. I signed my name. When I finished, I closed the book. The tower responded. Not with sound, not with movement, but with a shift in perception. The boundaries of the interior softened. The edges of objects lost their sharpness. The space felt larger than its dimensions allowed, as if perspective itself had been adjusted to accommodate something beyond immediate sight. I remained calm. My breathing was steady. My thoughts were clear. At 18:19, the sun slipped below the ridgeline. Twilight settled quickly, deepening shadows and restoring the ambiguity that had defined the night before. The forest below darkened uniformly. No lights appeared. No figures moved. The tower did not test me again. At 18:31, I became aware of a sensation I had not felt before, not being watched, but being referenced, like a footnote appended to a larger text. I was no longer the primary observer. I was a verified source. I understood, then, what had happened to the missing rangers. Not that they had vanished, but that they had completed their function. Their observations had been fully integrated. Their physical presence had become unnecessary once the record was complete. The tower did not trap people. It finished them. At 18:47, I stood at the center of the cabin and listened. The silence was layered now, containing echoes of routine reports, footsteps, radio calls, and quiet moments of attention accumulated over years. None of it was loud. None of it demanded notice. It simply existed, preserved. I did not resist. When the radio activated one final time, it did not broadcast. It did not receive. It clicked once, softly, like a period at the end of a sentence. The lights inside the cabin dimmed slightly, adjusting to the deepening dusk. Outside, the forest waited, indifferent and vast. I am still here as I write this. The tower remains standing. My name remains in the log. Tomorrow, another ranger may arrive to relieve me, or the schedule may change again. It does not matter. The record is complete. And when I eventually leave this place, whether by trail, by reassignment, or by omission, the tower will not follow me. It will not need to. It will remember that I stood here, watched carefully, and wrote everything down.